So in SharePoint 2013, we are able to focus on site security, and the reason why we can focus on that at the site level is because SharePoint decouples authentication and authorization. So there's many ways to configure authentication for a SharePoint server, but it doesn't matter how you do it, because however it's configured, you're always going to deal with the same set of objects in the context of a site. So regardless of the system that performs the authentication within a site, you're going to be dealing with an SPUser. So any type of claims provider that is written is always going to know about the SPUser, and it's going to be using those objects. It's kind of the same. A good analogy is how ASP.NET membership works. And it's kind of the same thing. You have the user class in ASP.NET membership, and so that's just part of the interface. And so when you write a provider, you're going to be returning instances of that user class. So it's kind of following that same pattern, which allows us as developers to not worry about that level. We can concentrate on just dealing with the user. We know we can just trust the abstraction. We can just depend on that abstraction and knowing that we're going to get that SPUser no matter what. So one thing about the SPUser is it doesn't actually have to be a user. It's actually a security principle that the authentication mechanism recognizes as valid. It actually could be it could represent an Active Directory group. It could actually be a user. Or when we're talking in the context of security principles, there's basically 3 security principles in SharePoint. That's the user, group, and role. Now SharePoint group is just a collection of users. And then again, SPUserCollection is a collection of SPUser instances. SPUser as a user in a SharePoint site could also represent an Active Directory group. So the properties on SPUser: login name, email, notes, and there's more. For the group classes, there's SPGroupCollection, which is a collection of SPGroup instances. And again, an SPGroup is a group in a SharePoint site. And SPGroup has most of the same properties as SPUser, and that's because they both of those classes inherit from the same base class, which is SPPrincipal. So there's 2 key classes that expose properties of SPGroupCollection, and the first is SPWeb, and it exposes a groups collection that contains all of the groups with permissions in the site. I emphasize site because it's only that particular SPWeb. It also has a second property, site groups. Now this is different. Site groups, that's all of the groups in the entire site collection. SPUser also has a groups property, but that's just only the groups to which that user belongs. And then there's an owned group property, so that's just all of the groups that that particular user owns. And associated groups are also a property of the SPWeb class. And it's actually not an SPGroupCollection, but it's actually an list of SPGroup instances. And so the SPWeb.AssociatedGroups contains the groups that are associated with a site. It also controls the quick launch groups that show up on the people and groups page. So when you create a group in the code, you should add it to the Associated Groups collection. That way you'll be able to include it in the quick launch menu on the people and groups page. When you're creating a web, so when you're creating a site, you can use the create default associated groups method, and that will create the standard owners, members, and visitors groups that we looked at in the previous demo. And that would happen when you're provisioning a site programmatically. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to take a look at creating a SharePoint group using the object model. Okay, I've already created a solution in Visual Studio, so I'm going to Let's take a look at that real quick here. Create a solution for our chapter 13, and I've added a project, a console application to it called Create Group. And here's the code for this. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to create a new group, and then we're going to add it to the associated groups for the web. So I have some code already on the clipboard, just my standard using statement to connect to my site. So this is the URL of our site, and just using good programming practice here by using statements to properly dispose of the site in the web. So now that I have a web to work with, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a user. Actually, not going to create a user. I'm going to grab the primary administrator for the site collection. Which is going to be my account. And I know there's only one, so I'm going to cheat here a little bit and just use the first index, so I know that's my account. And then next I'm going to call web.siteGroups. Site groups, that's all of the groups in the site collection. I'm going to call it my group. The owner is going to be the primary admin. We don't really need a default user, so I'm going to just make that null. And description, I'm just going to say created from code. Okay, that's going to create the group. Now I need to get a handle on that group again, because I want to add that group to the associated groups. So now I can say web.siteGroups, and this time I'll use the indexer of the name that we just created. And I'm going to call add on this list, pass in the group, and what we have to do is we have to make sure we call web.update, otherwise this won't get persisted into the content database. Okay, I'm going to run this. Let's just take a look at the site, make sure it's not there. So go to site settings, people and groups, and here's our groups right here. I'll click on more just to show all the groups, and notice there is not a my group here, so close this out. Let's run this. Okay, that should finish here in just a second. Okay, let's go check the site now. Go to site settings, people and groups, and here's our group that we just created. So you can see right here we've created the group, we added it to the web.associatedGroups list, and it shows up on the quick launch on the people and groups page. So that's how you create a group programmatically. Now we're going to look at the SPUserCollection class, and that's a collection of SPUser objects. And the SPWeb exposes 3 properties of type SPUserCollection. There's all users, and that's users with explicit membership or those who have browsed to the site as an authenticated user. So when we say explicit membership, that means somebody explicitly added them to one of the groups on the site, or they browse to the site as an authenticated user. And site users are all users that belong to the site collection. And then users are users with explicit permissions in the site. So the names of the first two, all users and site users, that's a little confusing. All users applies to the site, and then site users applies to the entire site collection. Therefore, site users has a lot more items in it than all users does. And then the SPGroup.user property, SPGroup.users property is also of type SPUserCollection, and it contains the users with explicit membership in the group. Okay, so we were talking on the previous slide that I was just showing, I was using the term explicit membership, and it's important to understand the difference between explicit and implicit membership in a site or group. So recall that an SPUser is the security principal that's recognized by the authentication provider, and it could be either a group or a role. So if you add a user directly to a SharePoint group, then that user has explicit membership. You've explicitly added them to a group. But let's say, for example, if you added a security principal like an Active Directory group to a SharePoint group, then the SPGroup.UsersCollection would contain a single SPUser instance for that Active Directory group. And so then any of the users that are inside that Active Directory group, they have what is called implicit membership. So they haven't explicitly been granted, but because they're in that Active Directory group and that Active Directory group has been added to one of the SharePoint groups, they have implicit membership. And so implicit membership is kind of a challenge for developers when we're writing code, because it deals with users. Well, when we write code that has to deal with users and user information, there are users who have access to a site, but SharePoint doesn't know about them via membership in a group. So if somebody has been added to an Active Directory group and that Active Directory group has been added to one of the SharePoint groups, well, they'll be able to authenticate to the site, but if we try to deal with them in code, SharePoint doesn't know about them. SharePoint doesn't know until they've actually logged into the site. And so if the user hasn't logged in yet and you're trying to get an instance of that user, you're going to get a null reference exception. And so one way around that is the SPUserUser method. So what that does is that ensures that a user exists in the site users collection. So that's a way to solve the problem, and it's very useful because sometimes you may need to get a property of the user, even though that user is never logged into the site, but maybe you need to get, some metadata about that user to do something, maybe their name or display name or something. And so that's where SPUserUser is very useful when a user who hasn't logged in, they may not exist explicitly in the SharePoint site, but you need to do something with that user. So again, a good example, user who's in a domain group with access to a site, and you may need some metadata for the user, like assigned to and a task. So if a user is assigned something in a task, but they've never logged on to the site, or they're just in a domain group with access to a site, those are some instances where they don't have explicit membership. An example where you may really need to do something with that user is, let's say you need to find out their email address so you can send them an email. Well, you don't have that information yet. You could get an error. So the SPUser class has a small amount of information about a given user, but each SharePoint site contains a special list called the user information list. And that it just contains extended information about users on the site. So things like their email address, some basic profile information. Now a user gets added to this user information list whenever they first log into a site. Then, unless they're explicitly created, explicitly added to the site, or if they log into the site, they're going to get added to that user information list. So if you give a user explicit membership and permission to a site, by adding the user to a group, they'll get added to the list. Or if they just log onto the site, they'll get added to that list. The way we accessed the the user information list, is it's a property of SPWeb. It's this SPWeb.siteUserInfo list. And it's just a standard list, works just the same way as you would work with any other list in SharePoint. And each user information item is just a normal SP list item. But the important thing to note is the ID value of the list item is the same value as the ID property of the SPUser. So what we're going to do, so the shared ID makes it easy to get the SPUser for a given user information item. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to create a console application that's going to use the SPUser class and the user information list. And then we're also going to go, not only just do that, but we're going to look at how implicit membership works and explicit membership, and then we'll take a look at how we can set properties and read properties from the user information list. Okay, back to the same Visual Studio project. This time I've already gone to my domain controller and I created a group called SharePoint Users, and I added a user to that group. I created a user in Active Directory and created Alice Smith and added her to the SharePoint Users group. So what we're going to do now is I want to add that Active Directory group to the visitors SharePoint group. That's the first thing we're going to do. So I'm going to comment this code out here. Okay, so I'm going to get a hold of the visitors group, and so I'm going to do a nice little trick here to get a hold of the visitors group. Instead of having to do web.groups and then having to memorize the name of the visitors group, because remember it was like the name of your site and then visitors, and you'd have to like do a lot of coding around that. I can use the associated visitor group, and that gives me that exact group. So it's nice. It's all done in the compile time checking. I don't have to put any magic strings in there, so that's a nice thing. Okay, so now I have a handle on the group, so I'm going to call visitors.addUser. I'm calling addUser, but I'm actually adding my Active Directory group. So my domain is MCC. My group is SharePoint Users. So that's the login name. There is no email for the group, so I'll make that string.empty. And I'll call it, I'll just make it a little bit different. I'll just say awesome SharePoint users, just to give it, so the name, this is the name, is how the group is going to show up in SharePoint. So just to show that they're different. Because the Active Directory group is SharePoint users, but looks like I made a typo there. Okay. And for last description part, we'll just say created from code. Okay, so now, so far, we've added, I didn't run this yet, but we're going to be adding the Active Directory group to the visitors group. And I'm going to go ahead and just write that out to the console. Just do a console.writeLine. Visitors.users. I know there's only one in there, so I'll just use the first one. And we'll say .name. Okay. And let's just go ahead and run that. Let me put a console.readline in here. Well, let's just make sure that that got created, that gets created, so I'll run it. Let me just cancel that real quick. So let's go to the site and just make sure visitors is empty. There's visitors. It's empty. Okay, good. So let's run this now. Should add our Active Directory group. And there it is. So notice how it wrote out the name of the user as the name of the group, and it's actually writing out the name of the SharePoint group, because the name of the Active Directory group is just SharePoint users, but the SharePoint name is awesome SharePoint users. So we know that it's in that visitors group. So go check on the site. Go site settings, people groups, look on the visitors, and sure enough, here is our SharePoint users AD group. And you can see here, here's the account, MCC/SharePoint users. So that's that. Let's comment this out now. Okay, now what I want to do, got that group created. I also have a user in Active Directory named Alice Smith. So I'm going to get a hold of Alice, and she's in that group. So right now Alice is an implicit member of the SharePoint site. She's not explicit because she hasn't been added to a SharePoint group, but she is part of that Active Directory group that's added to the site. So we'll just say SPUser Alice. And here's where we're going to use EnsureUser. And it's the domain name, and then Alice, Alice.Smith. And then we'll just write Alice's name out. And this is actually interesting because when we're calling EnsureUser, it's actually reading the information from Active Directory. So the Active Directory, let me take that back. The Active Directory authentication provider, when it creates an instance of the SPUser class, it extracts all those attributes from the Active Directory object and puts it into the SPUser object. So that's how we're going to get this name here, the name property. That's coming from, it's populated in SPUser, but it's coming from Active Directory, and our authentication provider takes care of that for us. We don't have to worry about that. So let's go ahead and run this again. The other thing that's happening is that when we call EnsureUser, it's adding Alice to the user information list. It looks like, okay, so there's Alice Smith. That got that's coming out of Active Directory, but now it's in the SharePoint user information list. So now what we can do, I'm going to go ahead and comment this out as well. I don't want to. Well, actually, we could leave that there because if EnsureUser is not going to. If the user already exists, it's not going to hurt. So you can leave it there. So let's just do that. And now I'm going to get the user information list. And I'll use the web.SiteUser. SiteUser info list, so I don't have a nice clean way of getting to that list. The compiler is checking it. And now let's get Alice from that list. Let's get a list item of Alice. So we'll get Alice's record from the user information list. User info .get item by ID, and we know that these IDs are the same, so we can use the ID property of the SPUser object for Alice to get her record from the user information list, the SP list item. We know that should work. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to populate an item one of the columns in the user information list. So I'm going to populate about me, and we'll just say I am Alice Smith. Okay, and then we'll just update that. You can call SPList item update to make sure that gets persisted. And then I'm going to update some values of the SPUser object. Okay, so email name, and then we'll update the user. The SPUser will update. And then we'll just display, so we're updating the SPUser, but I want to display what the values are in the user information list just to show that they're staying in sync. So here I'll do a write line. And I'll write out item email, and we'll write out the item name just to show that these are in sync. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and run this. And this is a good test of SPUser because we know Alice already got created. And then we're also going to update properties in the user information list and then the SPUser object and just show that they are being synchronized across. So when this finishes, so there's writing Alice Smith. Now it's setting those properties. Okay, so I have an incorrect. The email field doesn't exist, so that's okay. That's fine. We can take a look at that. We can go to the user information list and see what that's supposed to be. So, but let's go ahead and take a look in our people and groups. Actually, I want to go back to what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go directly to the user information list. So let me navigate up to that. And the way you get to the user information list is you just go, it's just underscore layouts 15 user.aspx. That's actually incorrect. I accidentally typed in the wrong URL here. It's actually underscore catalogs and then /users. So that gives us the user information list. And so you can see here, here's our AD group. Here's Alice Smith. And you notice how we set her about me property. So let's just open that up. Now, this is what we messed up. I used the wrong field name here. So I'm going to update that to be work email. And notice how this is interesting. So we set this using the SPUser object. That's why it's set here. But when I was trying to read it, I used the wrong column name. So I didn't need the column name on the SPUser object because it's just a regular property. But in the user information list, when I'm trying to read it, I need to know the actual name of the column. So that's where the SPUser object is kind of nice to work with. So let me copy this. And I will just replace this. And we should be able to run this again. And it should work because we're just going to ensure the user again. So there shouldn't be any conflicts there. So I'm going to run that again. And this time it should display, after it shows Alice Smith, then it should show the email again. So it'll show test.com, Alice Smith, and it should show that work email. And there it is. There's Alice Smith the second time. Okay, so that's a little bit different. That time it didn't show the work email, it just showed blank. So let's go back. Okay. So that's interesting. Let's go back and take a look at that. Let's just put a breakpoint here. Let's run that again. Okay, let's step through that. See if anything showed up on the screen. Okay, so that did actually work. Okay, so that's working. And that's working. Okay, so everything is working correctly here. There's no errors. Okay. So everything is working correctly there. So the important thing to take away here is that we were ensuring user existed, so Alice Smith was in Active Directory. We wanted to ensure that she was a member of the site, so we called SPUser. And then once we did that, SharePoint actually, first of all, it gave us an instance of SPUser object, and then at the same time it also created an entry in the user information list. Then what we were able to do is go to the user information list, get an instance of Alice's record in that list, and then read her about me, or actually we set her about me field, updated that, and then we set the and we did that. We set that in the user information list. And then on the SPUser object, we set the email address, but then we read the email address from the user information list. So SPUser, we set the email, and then we read it from the different list, and we noticed that they were synchronized. So it was showing test at test.com, and the name, the SPUser.name and the item.name were both synchronized as well. So that worked exactly as planned. And that is how the user information list works inside of SharePoint.